Okay, the July meeting of the Board of Directors of JEA will now come to order. Ask everyone to step up for a moment of reflection to be followed by the pledge to the flag. Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. We've had an agenda published. Ask a motion for adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. Is there a second?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Campion. All in favor of adopting the agenda as presented, so indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Agenda is adopted. And I'll pause for a moment to introduce and welcome our two new board members, John Campion and Camille Johnson. Welcome. Glad to have you guys here.
Thank you.
This is the largest board meeting we've had in months. 6 board members, so it's very exciting. We're happy to have you here. We don't have anyone on the phone, do we? Okay, thank you, Melissa. I'll turn to our interim managing director and CEO, Mr. Zahn, for our safety briefing.
Thank you, Chairman. Safety is a core value of JEA. In the event of emergency, 911 will be called by Mike Roast as well as CPR. In evacuation, please look to your right, identify your neighbor, make your way to the stairs in an orderly fashion. Please use the handrail. And we will be exiting the plaza and proceeding to the southeast corner of Main and Church. Please safely cross the streets, and please, just a reminder, put your cell phones on silent for the balance of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zahn. Turn to our Chief Legal Officer, Jody Brooks, for our Sunshine Law and Public Records Statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a duly public noticed meeting. Notice has been published properly. We have quorum present in the room. Minutes will be taken, and we're in proper order to proceed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brooks. Time for comments from the public. Do we have any cards? Any public? Well, lots of public, but nobody wants to talk. That's okay. We'll move on to Council Liaison. Councilman Matt Schellenberg, nice to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity, but I'll pass today.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Also welcome our former Council Liaison, Councilman Anderson. Nice to see you, Mr. Anderson. I don't see Dr. Gaffney here. For anyone else from the Mayor's office? No? Then I'll recognize our first presenter, Carrie Stewart, with the results of our JEA Tower Residential Survey for 2018. Ms. Stewart. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and board members. Awesome. I know that you all are going to be considering the new strategic framework over the course of the next couple of meetings. I just wanted to very briefly talk about how JD Power fits in that. In that framework, our strategy will be guided by and evaluated against our 4 basic corporate measures of JEA's value. And we know them now as value to our customer, financial value, community impact value, and environmental value. The JD Power survey helps us understand how we are doing in all 4 of these measures. The results are clearly from our customers' point of view, but they are also a clear point-in-time reflection of how we are performing as a company. So let's get right to it. A couple of key takeaways. 2018 represented a period of volatility in our customer sentiment. We saw a spike in positive sentiment after the reaction to Hurricane Matthew, followed by fatigue after Irma. We'll go into that a little bit. Media discussion of a potential sale also played a role in shaping public opinion during this period. We finished in the 2nd quartile, which was not our target. Our target has been and will continue to be 1st quartile. The chief drivers of these year-over-year changes were customers' perception of power quality and reliability, communications, and billing and payment. And those of you familiar with those 3 drivers know that they are also 3 of the most heavily weighted of the drivers. So the impact in those areas were even more significant to our overall customer SAT score. This slide is very busy, but it does tell a lot at once. Again, we finished in the 2nd quartile off our target, but you can see here where we finished over FY17 and how we performed in each of the 4 waves for FY18. The last wave you see, we actually dipped into the 3rd quartile very briefly, so we brought the nose up for the landing for our final wave. Satisfaction for the industry as a whole remained stable over the period, so this was unique to JEA. Our overall customer SAT score was down 10 points from FY17 year end. Had we maintained the same score from the end of FY17, out of the 138 companies ranked, we would have finished number 25 nationally and well within the first quartile. Our actual final ranking was 44 out of 138. This is an interesting chart because it shows wave over wave scores from 2010 to present. And what you'll see is that we saw a huge spike in scores in wave 2 after Hurricane Matthew, followed by a return to normal levels, which is what we've expected. The interpretation of this spike is that when customers are concerned about life and death on a large scale, our performance and service was rated on a different scale. In other words, you appreciate things that are important following an emergency and you let the little things go. Customers were overall very pleased with JEA's response during Matthew. Counter to what we saw after Matthew was a decline in scores after Irma. The way we interpret this is simply storm fatigue by our customers. 2 hurricanes and extended outages in less than 12 months made customers less forgiving when restoration efforts did not meet their expectations. And I'll add to that communication as well as restoration efforts. And we'll see that when we go into some of the verbatims. On the heels of Hurricane Irma, there was a very public discussion on the potential sale of JEA. This conversation became very politicized and was covered extensively in local media. We know from all of our past J.D. Power research that media coverage and media tone can have dramatic impacts on the way our customers perceive us as a company. Even coverage that is interpreted as neutral by customers tend to drive lower scores. To date, our customer satisfaction scores have not recovered to their past trajectory. Another very busy slide, but it tells a lot. Again, those 3 very influential factors contributed most to the year-over-year decline were power quality and reliability, which makes up 28% of the weight of the overall score, communications, which is 14% of the weight, and billing and payment, which is 19% of the weight. The good news is we did still outrank the industry average, as well as our peer utilities in the South, as well as the state of Florida. Let's jump into power quality and reliability briefly. The story around outage notifications is really interesting. You'll see there's a big effect for power and quality and reliability from 2017 to 2018. That means that when we give an ETR, an estimated time to restore, and we actually restore before or on time, that's a customer satisfier. And it should be no surprise that if we restore after the promised time, it's a dissatisfier. But again, what we are seeing is it supports our theory that people ran out of patience during a second year of hurricanes. On to communications. We had negative media coverage that rose in 2018, impacting our customer satisfaction. We know that utility communication recall can overcome potential negative impact of media stories, and conversely, exposure to media stories but lack of utility communications results in lower overall satisfaction. So what we tried to do over the course of this year when we saw these numbers going down was to up our positive and educational utility communications through all of our channels while J.D. Power was in the field. We noticed also that there is an opportunity to convert 52% of our customers who report no utility recall at all, even given our best efforts. So again, we will continue by increasing our communications through all channels, particularly when J.D. Power is in the field surveying our customers. Perceptions of billing and payment. Again, this weighs 19% of our overall customer satisfaction score. The most common open-ended comment, which you won't see on the slide, on how to improve billing refers to the fees that are associated with our credit card payments. Knowing that that's not something that we can do anything about, we did take a look at 3 areas for these purposes today of where we have opportunities. And we're looking at increasing bill alerts, educating customers about smart meters, and reducing the number of web clicks to complete an online payment. We're looking at other ways for payment as well as we move into the future and we try to innovate the way our customers do business with us, but those are 3 concrete areas where we know we have issues. So moving on to some verbatim comments. We'll have a couple of slides of verbatim comments that are a little uncomfortable, but we need to see them as a company to understand how to get better. The verbatim comments regarding outages and restoration often cite the lack of communication. It's clear that individuals scoring us lower on overall satisfaction are not happy with our communications that they are receiving regarding outages and restoration. All of the comments on this slide come from respondents that scored us below 700 on overall customer sat, but our final score, if you may remember, was 737. Shifting these perceptions will likely make an impact on overall customer sat. There are just as many comments praising the reliability and consistency of JEA power outage and restoration efforts, and it should be no surprise these are the same customers that scored us high in overall satisfaction. And just for fun, I'll let you see some of those comments at the end. We'll get through some of these more negative ones first. So although there were no comments explicitly linking information to media, whether that was TV, newspapers, social media, these comments imply that customers are getting their information through these media outlets. There's an overarching theme of these comments, though the number of them is small. The overall number is small, but they are very strongly worded, that JEA lacks honesty and transparency with their customers. So we'll end on the positive comments that we did receive during the hurricanes these are all from Irma. So again, it clearly correlates back to our idea that they had hurricane fatigue. We know we responded well. We know that we restored well. We communicated well. We could have done a lot better. We've spent the last year since last hurricane season working on our outage communications. We hope we don't have to use them again this year, but we are ready, informed by the remarks that we received from JD Power. And finally, what are we going to do about all of this? Well, your customer experience team is drilling down on each individual index that makes up each driver to understand where we can improve. We're also re-enrolling in Market Strategy International's annual Cogent study for utility trusted brand and customer engagement. We've used them in the past, and they provide a 360-degree approach designed to transform how electric and gas utility providers measure and track brand trust, customer engagement, satisfaction, and relationship strength with residential customers across 130 utilities. There is a lot of overlap with JDP, but they drill down further, and it's information that we've had in the past, but we have so focused on JD Power, we've not paid attention to a lot of that data. So in addition to the data from FY18, we are also going to get our last 4 years' data and match those two sets of data up between MSI and JDP to see if we can identify any further gaps. Lastly, we'll be using an automated self-assessment tool provided by our partners at Gartner. We're going to take all of this information to identify the strengths and gaps to map our way back to the first quartile. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stewart. Questions for Ms. Stewart? Ms. Flanagan?
Very, very well presented. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Cumber?
I'm good, thank you.
Ms. Green?
None today.
Ms. Johnson?
None today, thank you.
Mr. Campion?
Other than that, it was well put together, and the perception of billing and payment I found quite interesting. I actually made some notes on that, and reduced the number of web clicks to complete an online payment certainly stood out.
Yes.
That if somebody's looking to pay their bill, make it easy for them.
That's
so
right.
I was well pleased to see this and read this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Obviously disappointing. I appreciate you pulling the nose up in the last wave, but I also recognize, as I believe the other members of the board do, that it was an extraordinary year in terms of the two major storm events and the public discussion, and no doubt that influenced the results of this most recent JDP survey. I would say that while power quality and reliability are beyond our control to the extent they're impacted by storm, certainly communication is within our power
Absolutely.
to control. And I would ask you and your staff to redouble your efforts at improving our communications. We do have channels of communication available to us to reach our customers, and I think increasingly they're relying upon those alternative channels. So not exclusive. I mean, my kids don't watch the TV news, for crying out loud. They're watching their little screens. So hopefully we can increase those our communications efforts through those channels.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next up's our consent agenda. Presented in the agenda that's been adopted. I'd ask for a motion to adopt the consent agenda.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Green. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Consent agenda is approved. Call on our interim CFO, Mr. Wanamaker. How are you, sir?
Great, how are you?
Great, thanks.
So I am presenting our corporate metrics dashboard. It's behind tab 3B in your packets. This is a new report for us. You may recall in previous board meetings, we talked about alternating between our traditional operations report and sharing this corporate metrics dashboard.
Brian, before you get started, at the seats, there was an update.
I'm
Is there
sorry.
an updated version of it that's in people's books?
Yes, there's an updated version, I'm sorry.
So the one that was in the email from Ms. Charleroi is not the most recent?
No, there's a couple of minor changes.
Rats.
I apologize.
The handout, write the paper.
I can
Sorry.
blow this one up and read it more easily.
I apologize.
It's all right.
I saw people trying to follow
Yeah.
along, and I didn't want you to have the wrong
Sure.
document.
Thank you,
in
Ms.
front of them.
Brooks. You can proceed, Mr. Wanamaker.
So this report consolidates all of the corporate metrics that we look at on a monthly basis, both financial and operations. And so we'll begin presenting this report on a bi-monthly basis. And as we move through our strategic planning process over the next year and start to look at the board's framework for value, we plan to update this as appropriate with new metrics. And you'll see us begin moving toward providing consolidated financial statements, projections, and managing the business toward more growth and profitability. So I'll start on the upper right-hand side of this page under our pay for performance metrics, so the speedometers over there. We talked about JD Power, residential and business. You just heard from Carrie on that. Residential was finished in the second quartile. Business customer satisfaction finished in the first quartile. Unfortunately, both of those were below our targets for the year. Our targets for those were first quartile on residential and first decile on business. So we will not be achieving those pay for performance metrics this year. On the cost metrics on the left-hand side of that box over there, I'll start with the electric cost metrics. The current projection has us meeting targets. However, small movements in actual O&M, capital spend, and summer month sales will determine the achievement of this metric, and it's going to be down to the wire. To give you a sense for the impact of sales, target sales when we developed this metric were 12,390,000 megawatt hours, and we're currently forecasting 12,326,000 megawatt hours. So that's causing some pressure on that number. If July to September sales come in the same as last year, sales will land at 12,364,000, which we believe will probably put us right there. I think it's going to come right down to the wire, but I think we have a chance to make that one. On the water and sewer metrics, water business, water, sewer, and reclaimed sales are all down compared to last year, even though we have seen and continue to experience customer growth in those systems. It's really a function of less outdoor watering demand and irrigation due to the wet weather that we've had over the past few months. This causes upward pressure on the metric as well. On the sewer side, I do think we're going to make it. We've got a couple of sewer projects that are very large on the CapEx side that are going to probably roll into the first quarter of FY19. And so I think we're going to be able to make the sewer metric. On the water side, it's going to be much more difficult. And in fact, I think water will be unlikely to make that metric. So the bottom line on this cost projections, I think sewer we're very likely to make, water we're unlikely to make, and I think the electric is on the fence, but I think it's certainly attainable. The last one on that pay for performance section is the safety metric, and our current metric for that is 1.4 time or 1.4 recordable incident rate. We currently stand at an RIR of 1.54 as of the end of June. The good news is the current trend for July is 1.44. We've had one recordable so far during the month. And so I think with a couple more good months, we have a real opportunity to hit this one. And that would be a real win for us. We've had a number of years in a row where we've missed on the safety metric. And so that would be a really great one to achieve. Moving to the left side of the page, I know there's a lot of metrics on the left side, but I'll kind of give some high-level comments there. Electric sales are running ahead of last year, but behind our goal for FY18. The increase in base revenue is almost entirely driven by a return of normal winter weather in FY18. If you may recall, FY17 was a very warm winter, and so we did not have that electric load that we typically have for heating in the winter. All the electric operating metrics are in line and look very good. These include outage, frequency and duration, 75, and our generation fleet reliability. On some of the operating metrics for water, they're slightly behind target. There's been a couple of items there that I'll note. Unplanned outages is behind goal due to an event where we had a break in a large water transmission pipe in Nocatee that caused a rather significant outage there. This event was also the main driver behind the average system pressure metric being behind its goal. And then finally, the customer response time on the water system is also a little bit behind target. That's driven by we had a number of customers with pipe freezes behind the meter during the winter, and so we had a number of calls from customers asking us to come out and turn off the water while they got that fixed, and so that drove up some of those metrics. On the financial metrics, everything looks very good. The rating agencies for both metrics, for both systems, are all look strong and are in line with expectations. One item I will point out is on the electric side, debt to asset percentage. The debt to asset percentage has gone up in FY18, and it's really just a function of the shutdown of SGRPP and the accounting entries associated with that, with the impairment charge when we shut that down. And so we're not concerned about that. It's just a function of the accounting changes. And then finally, on the capital side, on electric, current forecast is $190 million as we stand here today. There's a couple things driving that, and the big one is our purchase of land for our solar projects that were approved by the board earlier this year. We have several properties that are under contract and in various stages of diligence. They may or may not close by the end of the year, and so that will push it into either FY18 or FY19, depending on where those kind of fall out. The one thing I will note as well on the capital is the two-way meter conversion project is ahead of schedule, and we expect to trend additional funds for those projects this year to keep them moving forward. So that's a good news. And we also have recently added an additional $2 million for electric service installation and distribution expansion as we're seeing growth throughout the service territory. Also very good for the business. So moving to water, the water capital forecast is currently $195 million. Again, we have several large projects that we expect to have considerable spend in the fourth quarter. The Blacksford wastewater treatment plant, that's one of the major ones that I was referring to that should be completed in early FY19. And that's in the southern part of our service territory. We also have a total of $14 million budgeted for resiliency on the water system, pump station, electrical reliability improvements, generators, and switches, controls, pumps, those sorts of things. And that they're expecting to spend about $10 million of that in the fourth quarter. So with that, I will take any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Campion, any questions for Mr. Wanamaker?
No, thank you.
Ms. Johnson?
No, thank you.
Ms. Green?
First, thank you for, I'm enjoying the dashboard. It kind of gives us an overview of being able to see everything in a glance. How is it working for you guys?
Great. I can tell you that we have had, again, we've had a number of metrics around the organization, and so it's nice to have it all in one place. And again, we're going to be utilizing this and improving upon it as we move forward and update it with our strategic plan.
Great. Have we done anything differently to show the increase in the safety trends?
So there's been some focus throughout the organization. Certainly, I think there's been a heightened awareness of it as we've gone through the last several months. We've certainly put an increased push on making safety first and foremost as we go through the day, making sure people aren't trying to get distracted and that sort of thing. So I think that's probably part of it, but it's part of what we do every day. So I think it's just an increased focus on it.
Yeah, the thing I'd point out to you is obviously the target metric is a metric that's an aggressive metric to begin with and well below industry standards to begin with. Safety is discussed on weekly meetings, both at a senior staff level as well as throughout the organization at different levels of the organization. One of the things that we're looking at is a method of being able to communicate safety protocol in a more automated fashion in kind of shorter snippets. We haven't yet adopted it, but we're investigating it as part of something that we can use as an executive team to communicate with all 2,200 employees on a more cohesive and concise at the same time. So, we'll let you know where we fall out once the evaluation of that type of method is done, but we're always looking at ways to improve the coordination of communication from top to bottom to make sure everybody's on the same page. Much with customer feedback in terms of open transparency and communication, we look at the same thing on internal communication.
That's good. I didn't know if there was an improvement in equipment or we were changing, adding additional safety mechanisms, but it's good to hear that the improvement is there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Mr. Cumber?
A couple things, Ryan. First, on credit ratings. I know we had, I believe it was a watch, and I don't remember whether it was Moody's, S&P, or Fitch, when the discussion regarding privatization occurred. Is there any update from any recent conversations with credit rating agencies that give you comfort that they feel more comfortable where we are today with those discussions as opposed to where we were?
Yes. We met with all the rating agencies several months ago. It was a very productive conversation. I think it was very well received. They did not express any concerns at that time, and in fact, I think they were very receptive to kind of our path forward, and we laid out the plan for the next year as far as our strategic plan and that sort of thing. And it was, like I said, I think it was very well received. I haven't had any negative reactions from them at this time.
Great. And just so I'm interpreting net revenue the same way you are, just define that term for me.
Net revenue?
Yeah, only from the standpoint of, I just want to make sure it's, it's both revenues, expenses, there's nothing else in there, because I was a little surprised to see a delta of $52 million between what our target was for year to date and where we are. That's a pretty significant gap. And so what's driving that?
So it's sales. I mean, it's a very capital-intense business, right? And so every incremental sale dollar, every incremental kilowatt hour that we sell, is drops very, very much to the bottom line. And so it comes back to the conversation that we've had about revenue stability and looking at the challenges facing the business. Because we bill for volume on a kilowatt hour basis, it tends to exaggerate those sales differences, particularly on the electric system. The water system is not as sensitive to those changes.
So if you had to reforecast right now do we catch up any of that delta, or does that continue to get wider through the last quarter?
I don't think it's going to get wider through the last quarter. Summer tends to be some of our more consistent sales months, and so I wouldn't expect it to continue to widen.
Okay, and then, and is that driving any discussion internally, and if so, what projects from a CapEx standpoint are you? My hope is the automatic reaction is, and we're going to defer some CapEx projects that we actually need to do. But if that is part of the conversation internally, it'd be helpful for the board to just know what, what those conversations are and what may be pushed out.
So we're taking a hard look at it. Again, we are coming in. I think we're going to be very close to our cost metrics on a cost per megawatt hour basis. We always take a look at our capital to make sure that we're deploying cash in the right areas and investing in the system appropriately. And we will continue to do that as we move forward throughout the year.
So let me ask it a different way. On your capital program execution, you are $102 million. There's a delta between what you've spent to date and what your goal was. What was pushed out? What consists of that $102 million?
$40 million delta.
213 to 315,
Oh, I'm sorry.
right? Because that would equal both the electric
That's
and
the
water
combined,
together,
yeah.
correct? So there's $102 million of CapEx that has not been spent.
So
Year-to-date.
what I would say is we do expect CapEx over the final few months to come in. There are a number of large projects and items that are still to come. One of which you'll hear today, some land purchases for not on the electric side, the solar stuff, but also on the water side, we've got some land purchases for some wastewater treatment facilities as well that are included in CapEx. And so that number will tighten as we go through the final quarter. I don't know that we'll hit it, to be fair, but it will tighten substantially.
To go back to your initial presentation, Ryan, and perhaps in response to Mr. Cumber's question, I thought I heard you say that you expected to come in sort of right on line with the electric by the end of the fiscal year and fall short on water and make it on wastewater.
Yep.
Does that sort of answer Mr. Cumber's question that we will true up through this peak demand period of summer on the electric?
I think so, yeah. Again, on the water system, there's not, a lot of the capital on the water system is more renewal and replacement type activities.
I'm sorry, I was talking about operating, not capital. To address his original
The
question of
revenue
net
is the
revenue.
$52 million
Yeah,
delta.
the shortfall on net revenue, operating.
So you want part of the function is the way we forecast in terms of on the electric side, weather makes a significant impact on sales, as you might imagine, and given the season that we had in the wintertime, that had a significant impact over the winter. If you recall, back in May, we did have about a $7 million OpEx reduction that we were able to take effectively between April and May. April and May, we were able to have about a net $7 million OpEx reduction. We do start looking at CapEx, in order to balance the cash needs of the business. However, at the end of the day, you can't defer CapEx too long because you have to keep up in order to maintain value to your customer. The other, on the water side, the function on forecasting there is in prior years there's been a lot of under forecasting, much as a result of not having to keep up with the increased sales, and so there was a stepwise function that was applied for this year, and the concept of actually hitting that sales target probably was an aggressive goal to begin with, and would be one that you'd probably see hit next year given the growth in the system. So that being said, also what the team is doing, as you can start to see with this dashboard, it starts to create a high degree of visibility into the business with the consolidated financial statements and starting to manage the profitability. You'll see this is the issue with a revenue declining business, and cost cutting measures can only get you so far, and you need to start thinking about growth and driving profitability of the business in order to continue to manage cash at the end of the year. So I don't know if that helps answer some of the
It does.
questions.
So last comment I'll make is, so what I was trying to figure out off of this is, right, if you're a business, you think about it from a cash standpoint. So you've got your revenues, you've got your cost of goods, you've got your expenses. But if you're really looking at it from kind of a free cash flow standpoint, right, after you spend your CapEx, right, it's hard to come off of this sheet and see that. And in my analogy to, to a non-public sector business, your distributions, I'll use our interim CEOs, or what do you call it, stakeholders, shareholders, your the annual amount that we give to the city would be that distribution, right? And so it'd be helpful, as you guys are refining this, to actually have the board be able to kind of see that, because from a cash standpoint, to your point, if you're in a declining business, you want to be able to see very quickly that as revenues are dropping, as you guys are controlling CapEx and sizing it, we make sure that at the end of the year, we don't ask that question and realize that we're kind of upside down.
I think the forecast, there's two elements here. One is the goal is more a function of what I'd say big picture budgeting as opposed to bottoms up budgeting or zero-based budgeting as you might expect to see in the private sector, which we're going to start looking at. The second is also, as Mr. Wanamaker mentioned in his remarks, we have now produced consolidated financial statements on indirect method. So our plan is to present that to the board in the next month or two so that you can truly see the cash generation and investment activities of the business and see it with a high degree of clarity, so that you can understand where that's going. And then the other is certainly as we are rolling into the October 18 to October 19 strategic plan update, also truly creating a management case for the next 5 to 10 years, which, right now there's capacity cases, there's rate cases, there's all sorts of other cases. But really one of the things that we're going to start focusing on is a management case financial forecast that we can start to then look at the levers that we might pull as an organization in order to drive the business.
Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Cumber?
I'm good, thank
Ms.
you.
Flanagan, questions for Mr. Wanamaker?
Thank you, Ryan. There's a lot of great information here. Appreciate you putting this together. If you're open to suggestions, I might suggest including stoplights of good and bad, because there are particular metrics where a higher number is a good thing versus a bad thing. So that might just help the reader. I wanted to follow up on Ms. Green's commentary around the RIR. I felt like last month there was a mention in the presentation that we were ahead of, doing better than what our year-to-date target was on incidence ratings. So to see the needle, for lack of a better term, switch from good to bad in a period of a month, I'm curious if there were particular incidents of note that drove that.
I don't know that I would say it's anything of note, but there were a number of recordable incidents in June that fed into that 1.54 number. Again, July was a much better month. It does tend to go up and down throughout the year, and we have a in the broader presentation, as you noted, there's a I think a month-to-month chart that shows that movement over time. And so we can also add the number of recordable incidents as a metric as well, if that would be maybe helpful.
And then finally, like Mr. Cumber, I was struggling a little bit in terms of understanding I also noted that for our net revenues year-to-date, we're behind our year-to-date goal. So then I was trying to drill into, well, what's causing that? And my observation was that electric, it appears that we're outpacing in a good way our year-to-date goal, and that the challenge seems to reside within the water revenue, where we're nearly 60 million behind the year-to-date goal. That seemed to be contradictory to what we most frequently hear in terms of water being the segment of the business that's growing and not as susceptible to the weather impact that we hear about on electric.
It's a great point and a great comment, and I think the answer to your question comes back to the 2017 comparable. And so, again, it was a warm winter last year, and so we had lower electric sales last year. So you're on the electric side, your year-over-year comparable is coming off a low comparable. On the water side, the flip side of having a warm winter is we have more irrigation load when we typically don't over those winter months. And so we have an opposite effect on the water side. So that's why you're seeing sort of a base revenue decline on the water side versus FY17. And again, it's largely driven by that irrigation demand. Yeah, yeah.
And it is also a function of the way the goal is set on the water side in terms of having increased it in order to catch up from prior years underestimating. So I think the point is a lot of work's been done to create a higher degree of transparency into the business. There's still a lot of work, and really appreciate the board's comments on that, and certainly we'll start to take those to heart and create that. I think the other thing that you'll start to see is we're going to start looking at TTM, trailing 12-month statistics, as well as looking at R12s and R24s going forward. And that, as you can appreciate, just takes some time to start to put into place those systems and tools. But that'll help to start to be able to track year over year, as well as rather than just a year to date, where because there is a high degree of seasonality, you can eliminate a lot of that seasonality through trailing 12-month statistics.
Thank you, Mr. Zahn. Thank you, Mr. Wanamaker. I will say that I appreciate the dashboard metrics as well. I echo Ms. Green's comments in that regard. I do think it would be a nice idea to follow up on Ms. Flanagan to have stoplights. And the other thing that strikes me and might be helpful is a variance to goal. We're doing the math in our head here, but you can do it a lot easier in Excel. I hate to suggest adding columns because already I think I need it printed on survey size paper. But I think those would be useful. I applaud Mr. Zahn, Mr. Wanamaker, and Ms. Dykes for undertaking this effort. All this material is derived from existing reports. We used to get the big operational reports each month. I think we're going to do that every other month now, so you get a in-depth presentation. But if any board member wants to see the backup to this, it's available. So you can reach out to Mr. Zahn or Mr. Wanamaker and get that as well. You passingly referenced the CapEx expenditure on smart meters. Maybe that'll help you, Ms. Stewart, in managing customer expectations the next time a storm hits. Any other questions for Mr. Wanamaker? Nothing on the financial report. You're still up with the recommendation to call a public hearing on a economic development electric tariff rate.
Yes, sir. 7,000 jobs, nearly $1 billion in planned capital investment, $300 million in annual wages.
I vote aye.
So now that I have your attention, I'm here to share with you a request to call a rate hearing to extend JEA's successful economic development rate tariff program, which is scheduled to sunset September 30th of this year. JEA's economic development program has been in place since 2013. The program was instituted to drive retention, expansion, and recruitment of business and commercial customers in the Northeast Florida region. Specifically, it's designed to attract relatively large electric customers who who are creating new jobs in JEA's service territory. It's important to note that the discounts associated with this program do not affect any other JEA customer bills. The program has been a major value driver for JEA and the community over the past several years. And in the vein of the value framework, which you guys are going to discuss later, it's driven community impact value as a successful incentive tool for both the City of Jacksonville and Jax USA partnership to attract and expand businesses in the area. It's driven customer value by increasing asset utilization of the system, and it has driven financial value by increasing free cash flow and allowing for rate stability. We've seen particularly good results of this program over the past 18 months and have up to 7 businesses currently going through the application process. So at this time, staff is requesting to extend the program application date by 1 year to September 30th, 2019, which will allow for additional customers to grow and expand in Northeast Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Wanamaker. Staff has requested a motion to extend the Economic Development Program until September 30, 2019. Do I hear a motion?
Sorry, it's to call the hearing.
Call the hearing. So sorry. Thank you, Ms. Brooks. I have you here. Is there a motion? Somebody?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. Second from Ms. Green. Discussion. Questions for Mr. Wanamaker? So this will come back for public hearing next month. Mr. Cumber?
Ryan, I noticed that we extended this 3 years back in 2015. Is the motion on the table to call, I guess,
Public
let me
hearing.
ask a clarification, a public hearing for a 1-year extension, or can we talk about whether it would be 1 year, 2 years, 3
We
years?
have to specify the term in setting the public hearing.
It does not have to be specified.
You want to amend your motion to just set a public hearing for,
I'd like to amend the motion.
to accept that
To-
friendly
I
amendment?
do.
Okay, so without fixing the term on the extension.
So as a discussion, what I would like to discuss at the hearing, so if you could just think about it is, if we extended it for 3 years, why are we extending it for 1
Yeah.
as opposed to multiple years now? And I would like to, it would be very helpful if you could reach out to the chamber, and I'd love to have the chamber here and just get their thoughts on whether it has worked, this program has worked as is, or if they were to be able to tweak it in order to be more competitive with recruiting companies, what suggestions they would have in tweaking the economic development program.
We can absolutely make that ask.
Right. Questions for Mr. Wanamaker on the motion? Mr. Campion?
No.
Ms. Johnson?
No, thank you.
Ms. Green? Ms. Flanagan? Okay, all in favor of the motion to set a hearing for extension of the Economic Development Program, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carries unanimously. Thank you, Mr. Wanamaker. You're excused.
Thank you.
Mr. McCarthy? Afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir, and board. In the item that I'll be discussing, we're requesting board approval for condemnation actions to obtain real estate easements that we need to construct an electric transmission corridor in the southern part of our service territory that is experiencing rapid growth. There's detailed information in your board packets in tab 3D and includes a listing of the different ownership interest and a resolution we'll use to file the condemnation actions. So in this slide, our current transmission corridor is shown in red, and our planned corridor is shown in blue. This project will provide increased reliability and redundancy by connecting our generating station at Greenland Energy Center in a loop with our existing Greenland and Bartram substations and our future Nocatee substation. Phase 1 of the project will connect Greenland Energy Center to Racetrack Road along Phillips Highway. Phase 2 will go along Racetrack Road and connect to the Bartram substation. Phase 2 will require narrow easements on 29 property sites to maintain code-required clearances along this 4-mile stretch. At this time, JEA has made monetary offers to all property owners for purchase of the easements, and we will continue to negotiate with property owners throughout this process. Today, we are requesting for condemnation on 27 parcels. However, our expectation is that we will have closed on a majority of the parcels by the time this matter is heard before a judge. This is a current picture of Racetrack Road and what we expect it to look like after the project is completed. The easements will allow JEA to perform vegetation management and maintain required clearances from the transmission line. The easements range from 10 feet to 45 feet in width. Upon board approval, we will go through the condemnation process to obtain an order of taking, which will allow us to begin construction while the process continues. We will continue to negotiate with the parcel owners throughout the process to bring the number of required condemnation actions down by the time of an order of taking. And you can see on the left, since these properties are in two different counties, we may be working through the courts in both St. John's and Duval as we go through this process. 3 of the properties are in Duval, and the remainder are in St. John's. That concludes my presentation. I can take any questions.
To get discussion going, may I ask for a motion to approve
Mr.
the...
Chair, if I could just make one comment, I'm sorry before. I may have to recuse myself from this, given the fact that there's some land holdings that border this, so I'm going to,
Sure. Let the record reflect that Mr. Cumbers recused himself from discussion and vote on the proposed motion.
Mr. Chair,
You're gonna have a conflict as well?
similarly, I recognize one of the ownership interests that may be an affiliate business interest of mine, so I would need to recuse myself as well.
We've established a quorum. We still got vote. We're good.
We're good. So
Okay.
there's two non-votes. We still have 4 for action of the board. Hopefully the other 4 don't recognize any of the property interests that need to be taken. Okay.
I will disclose, although it's not a conflict, that one of the property owners is a former client of my firm, not an active client. So may I ask a motion in response to staff's request for the board to approve Resolution 2018-05 for condemnation to be filed with the court and to authorize pre-suit mediation with a delegation of mediation settlement authority to the managing director and CEO or his designee, and finally to authorize negotiations with property owners before and after an order of taking. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Green. I'll take Ms. Johnson as a second. So discussion on the motion, Mr. Campion?
I'm fine.
Ms. Johnson? Ms. Green?
Only one question. Do you anticipate some pushback that's leading us to the condemnation? And I'm only thinking of the cost of going to court. So are you anticipating that some of the business owners will not settle?
I will. We need to request the condemnation action in case we do not. I think our expectation is we'll have this number down significantly, probably in the single digits, but I think it's likely that we may have some at the time we would go to the order of taking.
Okay. Thank you.
If I may, even with this vote and the resolution being passed, the JEA will continue to work to negotiate arm-length transactions with each of the property owners for these real estate interests. And if we have to do an order of taking in order for the project to proceed, if there's 1 or 2 or handful still that we weren't able to negotiate a proper real estate transaction arm's length, then we would go to court.
So we can begin even before the ruling. Okay, thank you.
Mr. McCarthy, in this, you may have to turn to one of your brethren on the senior leadership team. Anticipating questions regarding the possibility of undergrounding, is it feasible to underground 230 kV? Is that not practical?
I think I will refer to one of my brethren.
Mr. Brost?
Absolutely feasible. We have one 230 kV transmission line that's underground, short distance, some 138 kV, fair amount of 69 kV downtown. So the lower the voltage, the more feasible. It's much like distribution, it's expensive. For transmission, 230 kV, you're talking about a 10 times multiplier. This is about a $15 million project overhead. So
That answers the
150.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely feasible.
But not
But
advisable.
expensive.
Yeah, not financially feasible. Any other questions before we put it to vote? Again, I'll note that Ms. Flanagan and Mr. Cumber have excused themselves, recused themselves from this vote. All in favor of the motion as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carries unanimously. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. You've got
Chair.
one more?
Can you put your vote on the record?
Yes.
Aye.
I said unanimous. Okay. That implied me. Mr. McCarthy.
Okay, well, the next item is for the purchase of land to be used for a new wastewater treatment plant in the Greenland area. And this item also requires board approval. Detailed information is provided in the board packets in tab 3E. It includes an aerial photo and a one-page memorandum of the deal points, which I will refer to. So and I'm looking at the memorandum of deal points that's in your packages, and I'm just going to go over the general summary and the first 3 points. The JEA is seeking to acquire vacant land to be used for the construction of a regional wastewater facility to support its water and wastewater system in southern Duval County and northern St. Johns County. The project is critical for continued reliability and economic growth of JEA's water and wastewater system in the region. JEA has negotiated with Estuary LLC for the acquisition of approximately 185 acres located east of State Road 9B. And then it lists the purchase agreement and the terms. The first one, it's 185 acres to be acquired in fee simple, and with no less than 120 that would be upland acres, meaning they'd be dry. All easements that we'll need to have access to the property will be provided, and the purchase price is noted as $20 million, and our appraisal that we obtained was $21 million, so that's favorable. And I think the other items I'll just leave, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
Got a recommendation from staff for any recusals? Anyone have a conflict of interest? Okay. Recommendation from staff for a motion from the board to approve the purchase of approximately 185 acres for the development of a new regional wastewater facility at a cost of $20 million. Do I hear a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. Second from Ms. Green. Discussion. Ms. Flanagan?
So today we are being presented with the opportunity to purchase the land, and we have an understanding of the land costs. Have we been presented with information around the subsequent development of the wastewater treatment facility?
In terms of the cost of the wastewater treatment facility, right now we are evaluating the award for the engineer that will design it and build it. If you're asking me what's the budget for the wastewater treatment plant,
Blacksburg was a 6 MG facility at 50 million-ish range, and I would suspect about the same here. I can get that.
Mr. Calhoun, I'm sorry, we can't
Oh.
quite hear
So,
you.
it's about $100 million. This will be a 6 MGD facility, which has expansion capability to about 12 MGD. That's on the range of the same as the Blacksburg facility, which is on the southern part of our service territory and would service the vast amount of expansion that's going on as a result of the 9B extension here. It is part of our CIP in terms of looking forward. About a $1.1 billion CIP intended to be cash funded, pay-as-you-go over the next 5 years, at least on the water and wastewater side. Ultimately, also 2 MGD of the flow that currently goes to the Arlington East wastewater facility would be diverted immediately to this wastewater plant, thereby freeing up capacity in the other part of the system. So it's an order of magnitude. It's about right within the same range of treatment.
And both the land and the construction of the facility fits within the overall parameters of the plan that has been established and approved by the board?
Yes.
It's not a deviation?
It is not a deviation.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Cumber?
I'm good.
Ms. Green? Ms. Johnson?
I'm good.
Mr.
I'm
Campbell?
good, thank you.
MGD is million gallons per day. It took me a month or two being here to figure that out, yeah. So, okay, we've got a motion made and seconded for the approval of the purchase of 185 acres at a cost of $20 million. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. That takes us to our strategic portion of the discussion. Mr. Zahn.
Sure, and also in just a reminder, in keeping with the efforts to increase transparency and communication with the media and the public, this section is our strategy discussion at the board level, which is intended to discuss and obtain feedback from management on strategic initiatives of the company without specific action to be taken by the board. The strategic framework is a conversation that we started with the board April 17th, and then also continued with city council members around the need to obtain alignment between all the major stakeholders that have influence and votes relative to JEA's performance, both operationally and financially. What you have today is really a second version of what was presented at last month's board meeting, with the feedback that taken from the board to create it more, I think, in Mr. Cumber's direction and the entire board consensus, as a statement of direction from the board to the city council, as opposed to more of a resolution or request. What I would note is that over the last 3 months, the senior leadership has been undertaking twice a month, meetings to discuss the future of JEA, much in line with the process, trying to get it prepared for the strategic plan update. And part of that is really a lot of the work you see here was building a consensus amongst the entire senior leadership and obtaining some input from the employees, from our listening tours. So not only did we take the feedback from the board at last meeting, but we've also taken a lot of feedback and input and put it into this document for the board's consideration here. And with that, I'll leave it for you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I appreciate the effort that's been put into this by Mr. Zahn and the entire senior leadership team. It is significantly recast from that which was presented at the last board meeting. It is not yet proposed to be sent to City Council, so I'd ask each of the board members to take this draft and communicate directly back to Mr. Zahn any input or thought that you may have as an individual board member. He can then assimilate that, and we'll have an action item at our next board meeting. So if everyone would take some time between now and our August board meeting to do that, it would be appreciated. Mr. Zahn?
Thanks. And I think that the major view on the recasting is really the concept of driving value of JEA through 4 specific measurable elements, which you'll start to see specific key results and deliverables under each one of these value initiatives in terms of profitability, J.D. Power and Associates, contribution to the city, a number of these elements, as well as community impact when you look at JSEP and some of the things that we do around the community. And in fact, Mr. Cumber, we did meet with the Chamber of Commerce for a full day to figure out how JEA can be more impactful from an economic development perspective, specifically in relation to the community impact value. And with that, if I receive final comments from the board over the next couple weeks, then what we would do is move this up into the action item of the board agenda for a final resolution next month.
Thank you. Make it so. You're still up?
Yep, corporate headquarters, Ms. Kilgo. So this conversation started 3 to 4 years ago when a significant capital need was, and we did not strategically place the scaffolding outside, although you would have thought we did. It's an estimated about $35 million is required to update this building in order to maintain business continuity in the event of gray sky events. So what you see going around you right now is repairs as a result of Hurricane Irma, as well as trying to make this building
Waterproof?
Waterproof.
Okay.
Yeah, so that we don't get rain in it the next time we have a storm. That has led to, there's a whole litany of items from plumbing to electrical to fire alarm to the First Coast radio systems to a number of elements that build up to that $35 million, which then led staff over the last 3 to 4 years with Ms. Kilgo at the helm and Ms. Dykes as well, really leading the effort. And I'll let them walk you through this presentation. Our hope is to get the board's input on the last couple slides. Number one, the timeline and kind of proposed board interaction that we have in here. The second is on the process and the ranking criteria that we have outlined here. And that's where we're hoping to get some feedback in so that we can start moving forward.
Mr. Zahn, I just want to disclose to the chairman and to the rest of the board that I have a conflict of interest of a related business interest, so I will refrain from any discussion on this matter.
So noted. Thank you, Ms. Flanagan. Ms. Kilgo.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As Mr. Zahn said, we've been at this quite a while. He gives credit to Melissa and I, but there are others here in the facilities group and real estate group that have worked on this many more years. I just happen to have the great opportunity now to be involved. We do want to talk about business continuity risk, especially during storms or other emergencies, the aging building conditions. We have a lot of space here because we bought 2 existing buildings, but we could be much more efficient with our space, and it could work far better for us in a different location. We've done internal studies and analysis mostly since 2014. We had external consultants do a study in 2016 that was reported to the board in September of 16. From there, we engaged CBRE through a competitive process to act as our owner's representative. Stuart Green is here. They have provided really great advice and help. We also, through CBRE, conducted a workplace strategy. The initial phase 1 of what would we want to have the building program size to be, employee sentiment around workplace. So we've done kind of phase 1 of that and have some results. We've talked a lot about what should be included in the building. Should it be the current function? Should we expand it to include other parts of JEA or narrow it? Should we build a, Cat 5 storm hardened facility? So all those things have been under discussion and will continue to be as we kind of develop the program. We also conducted briefly conceptual studies, massing and height, on how could a building program fit within certain downtown blocks. We did consider one suburban site, which is a site that JEA owns already at Atlantic and Southside Boulevards, but we had an architect do a quick study of how many stories would you need as far as building and parking. We had talked about in July of 17 the city's block 48, and we wanted to be sure that what would do from a fit analysis. We also did a unnamed or unidentified approximate 3-acre site if we had a little bit bigger site, and then the JEA site was 5 or 6 acres, and try to look at massing and scaling there. So on this next example, you'll see pictures of how that might look, and some of those came from the study that we had done. The example on the slide in the middle, and that is slide 6, is a development that someone has recently proposed to us, and their conceptual scaling of what a building and parking deck might look like. If we go look at page 4, and I know they're ahead of me luckily on the presentation, we do show we have 360,000 square feet here. We need about 200,000 square feet based on the studies that we've done so far. We're projecting a little higher employee count than we have now in case of growth over the holding period, and more efficient office sizes, layout, etc. You'll see the potential locations that we have talked about and looked about during this last several months. These are just ideas. We do want to stay within the downtown investment authority's jurisdictional boundary, so that's kind of Brooklyn down past the stadium. A little bit later, we'll talk about other people that may also want to propose during this process. You'll see the examples here in the book on page 6. Also, from the ones that we've already shown, we've got a comparison kind of pros and cons. During this discussion, we started looking at existing space lease in some ways to look at could we move more quickly and how would the economics of that compare. We may, in existing space, not be able to have contiguous floors, so that would be security, just continuity concern. And then the parking may not be as readily available, may end up with multiple garages. And we'll just have to work through the details on those. But we're trying to look at a variety of options and help the board select the best one. Then on page 8, as Aaron discussed, if you see the band at the top, we're here now, July, early August, looking for your input, and then we will bring updates in the next few months. We would like to have the board have some evaluation after staff seeks any other proposers, any other locations, get your feedback in December, and then work toward contract and terms and hopefully be ready to go later in March of 19. And then so that we would love your input on page 8, and then on page 9 on the proposed qualitative summary. We've looked and presented what we think are probably good criteria. We've suggested some weights, but we would also like to know, would you recommend additional criteria, different weighting, removal of these criteria that would help us evaluate proposals that the ones that you've seen and any new ones that might be brought to us. And from there, I'll take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kilgo. You have been working on this one for a long time, but I'll note from our next agenda item that you have a record of success with projects that you work on for a long time. We'll get to that next. So for now, the staff is seeking direction and input from the board on the evaluation criteria for the new corporate campus. They've got suggested here 5 categories of criteria with proposed weightings, and I'll just open it up to discussion by the board as to whether or not these are the appropriate criteria and the appropriate weightings, or if there should be some added or some stricken. Mr. Campion. Nothing like being thrown right into the fire your first day.
Yes. I think space has a huge effect on productivity. Space has a huge effect on just company culture, and space has a huge effect on just interaction between people. So I think that's an important consideration. Downtown obviously is important. On first blush, I would say that these look to make sense. I'd like to give it some more thought, but certainly I think that again, how people work together, how they in a space is very, very important, and I think you can get an enormous benefit from that, and having engineering and finance working together helps facilitate communications that normally wouldn't happen. Even in my own business, if you've got engineering over here and you've got finance over here, they tend to silo. But if you sort of force them together, you end up with a different set of conversations, and I think those type of things are important. So, as I say, on first blush, it looks to be weighted correctly. I'd like to give it a bit more thought, and certainly as this process goes along, it'll be interesting to follow along.
I promise you'll get a second bite at the apple. To your last point, is that culture change opportunity that's sort of the opportunity to force different works? Okay.
Yeah, I
understand it.
think under culture change, you have layout as well as communication, as well as just the ability to be able to not only communicate verbally, but also through audio visual and other elements that can really create an environment that's far more productive. In this building, you have very much a tower effect that creates silos, and also the reality is a vast majority of our employee base exists outside of this campus, and so one of my main desires, if there were to, would be to try and find a way to drive culture where we create more of a cohesive 2,200 person company, that works well together.
Interacts within the same space. And I know that to that point also, Mr. Zahn and I discussed one opportunity of culture change that space can facilitate, physical space can facilitate, would be something like an innovation center where customers can come in and see new products, understand how solar might transform their home, and just a wide variety of things. I think all that fits to your point of how space can influence the culture of a company. Ms. Johnson.
I'd echo that sentiment. I think to that point, and I'd want to spend a little bit more time with it as well, but that almost begs the question, should the weight distribution be a little bit heavier there? Because the culture is such a huge part of the strategy, really where you're trying to transition the organization as a whole, does it make sense to give it a little bit more weight in the deciding criteria? Because it is important. It is important to bring in that aspect for the growth of the organization. So that'd be my initial thought.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Just at first glance, timing and risk to the contract and it's weighted, where it's weighted, other than having to wear rain boots to work, are we dealing with any structural damage to the current facility? So we need to speed up the time frame, or we're just a leaking ship?
So we have established.
I'm sorry, Mr. Zahn. All the employees of JEA out there are smiling to themselves and nodding, by the way.
We have established a backup emergency operations center that is off-site. We also have taken mitigation steps. I wouldn't say that any of the solutions are ideal. So I think your point on time and risk to contract is a good one. It might be, there might be an increase to that element as well. How to balance that against culture and program and development downtown and all those other things. I think this was just staff's initial recommendation.
Yeah, not necessarily that we need to change the weighted, but just I wanted to make sure that we weren't underweighting it or underestimating it if there was a structural.
There will be a function of, depending upon which way this conversation and decision goes, there will be a function of determining what the intermediate step might look like based on the time to occupancy, actually.
I just want to interject, and maybe you and Ms. Kogo can help me understand this. I thought that your concern was really under development schedule and the business continuity, and that timing and risk to contract really spoke to third-party negotiations. Did I misunderstand that, Nancy? Or?
I think probably Ms. Green's point might be as much on the second item, development schedule.
Okay.
And then the ability to bring it if that would be the selected alternative.
I was tying it to the timeline of the overall project.
The timing and risk to contract is more, especially some of these that are new developments, there's a risk of not getting permits. There's a risk of of the development being stalled for whatever critical mass that's required. Those types of things.
Okay. Anything else?
Nothing for it.
Mr. Cumber.
Just one clarification, then I have a couple comments. This 4-block development that's proposed, that includes our existing footprint here, right?
Yes.
So that is a private sector proposal to come in and, okay, got it. So a couple things. So on the, internally, what thought has been given to whether we need a single tenant building or we could be part of a multi-tenant building? Is there a security reason why we would need a single tenant building?
So we have talked about it, and we think a multi-tenant building could work. The preference would really be a single-tenant building where we control the security, designed it in. But on any of these existing building lease spaces, we have talked to security. We think it could be, floors could be keyed off, that sort of thing. It's just that you have, of course, more control and kind of full control if it's a single-tenant building.
So my initial reaction to your scoring on page 9 is, I'm sorry, just one other clarification. The A and the B, just help me understand how you were looking at, you score and you have A, and then we have cost annualized B.
So qualitative and quantitative.
Correct, and then you would, like, A and B would both be weighted 50%, or?
No, I don't think we
Okay.
envision having
All
a
right.
weighting of
Got
A
it.
versus and B, but just you'd have an A result and a B result, and
So here's my overall
Ultimately,
thought
that would be the
is, when I read beneficial downtown development and economic development, I think that's a very nice aspirational thing to say, but at the end of the day, I would hope we're looking out for JEA's interest first, right? And so if I read this scoring, I don't necessarily feel like I get what's important to the JEA employees and our business as being the driver of the decision. And what I would challenge staff to do is take a step back and say, what's best for our employees? Now, I think what you're going to end up seeing is beneficial downtown development, economic development will end up being a factor that is driven by whether or not JEA employees would be happy in a certain area. So, for example, if you guys came and said, look, here's a great place, we can build a building, and we have 800 employees sitting, somewhere where there isn't a lot of activity around that area, right? I'm not sure how that would necessarily score versus being part of a mixed-use development where where the mixed-use development is proposed, and we're part of that overall mixed-use development, right? I would think from a JEA perspective that would be more exciting to our employees. And so I would just kind of challenge as you think about this to first put the JEA hat on. And I think what you're going to see is the economic development and everything will kind of flow out of that, because you're not going to have a happy workforce if you put them in the middle of nowhere. But let's look at this from a JEA perspective, and let's, my view is let's skew the scoring from that perspective. I also think timeline is important, not necessarily timing and risk to contract. I kind of read that, I think, the same way you did. But I think we have to be realistic that if we're going to make a decision, let's make a decision, right? Because, at least from my perspective, I wouldn't want to be sitting here 4 years from now still kind of looking at scoring criteria. And then the last thing I would mention is, I think even though cost annualized may be viewed as quantitative, there is the question of whether or not you lease, whether you purchase, what's the life cycle cost of what we're going to do. And, public entities tend to sometimes forget that life cycle cost is important, right? And so I would ask you to look at that, and when you come back to the board with some thoughts, to make sure that you can walk us through why one option is better than another option from a life cycle cost perspective as well.
Yes, sir. And we had started looking at that as we started looking at different ownership or deal structures, so we can bring that too.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. I note again that Ms. Flanning has recused herself from this discussion. I would echo the comments from my fellow board members and underscore Mr. Cumber's observation, which was my primary observation, that benefit to downtown seems to me to be overweighted. I would put a higher weight, or perhaps equally weight, culture change and beneficial to downtown. And I don't know that it's necessarily a culture change. It may very well be. I like to think that we've got a good culture at JEA, but the opportunity to have a physical space that can influence, as both Mr. Campion and Ms. Johnson observed, the success of the organization strike me as being equally or more important than economic development. We certainly all want to be economic team players, but I think that's overweighted. The only other point I would make is that, as Mr. Cumber has observed, this has been going on for 4 years. I asked Mr. Zahn to put this on the agenda for today's meeting so that we could drive this process to a conclusion, and suggested the timeline should be a decision this year. The timeline there says that it'll come back to the board in December, and in the interim, staff will be soliciting other market solutions and evaluating proposals. My question to the board is, would you like to see this again before December when we're being asked to make a vote? I think I'd kind of like to at least get some informational reports on how staff is succeeding with those other discussions in the intervening 3 months. Any other thoughts on that, Ms.
I'd like
Green?
to see it as well prior to
Yeah.
coming back to the board meeting.
I think you're going to have to sort of parse the discussion and make a discussion soon, make a decision rather sooner than later if you're going to be part of a multi-tenant or you're going to do standalone. I think that's a gating item because they're two separate tracks.
Sure.
And I would be, personally, I'd be on the standalone. I think you lose an enormous amount by being in a multi-tenant building. You can't define your culture. You can't define your space. You can't be what you want to be as you're part of something else. You're in the JEA building or you're in somebody else's building. And I just think that one of the important discussions here first would be making that determination, and then that will help because everything else is going to branch off from that. That would be my thoughts.
Nancy is furiously taking notes.
I'm sorry.
That's all
No,
right. Yeah.
thank you.
It's good input. I tend to agree. Gating item. We can get the competing proposals, but you got to make a choice sooner, not later on that issue. Mr. Cumber, in your absence, we were just talking about timing and bringing this back to the board for a vote on the staff's recommendation in December. It's the current timeline, but having staff report back in the intervening board meetings on their progress. Okay. Anything else on this subject? If not, we'll move to the next line item. I'd like to invite our council representative, Mr. Schellenberg, to join us at the table as our guest for the discussion on the Southside capital allocation. This is something that will integrally involve the city council based on the current proposal from staff. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Zahn.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome, Councilman. What you have in front of you is a letter and proposal and some of the backup documentation in terms of financial analysis that was completed at direction relative to this proposal from June 12th. Again, it is, as you're aware, the divestiture of the Southside generating parcel on the south bank of the river has been completed in July. So the cash proceeds were received. And the proposal here is one that I think does hit all four of those corporate measures of value. Number one, certainly utilizing approximately $15 million of those proceeds to drive growth of our water and sewer customer base, has about a 2.5% return on investment, which isn't ideal, but certainly is above our current investment return or yield on cash. Secondly, it does have a community impact in terms of addressing an issue that's been a decades-long issue that's about underserved component of our community. Third is environmental. Certainly, nutrient pollution is a significant issue, especially when it comes to St. Johns River and septic tank phase-out addresses that. And then the last is economic development. And value to the customer, certainly adding customers that currently aren't our customers, while doing it at a rate neutral perspective for our existing customers is value to the customer. And so with that, I'll close and open it to the board.
Thank you. So the recommendation from staff is the proceeds from the sale of the Southside generating site, Southside generation site, hard to say 3 times fast, or even once, be utilized initially to commission an engineering study on innovative solutions to treatment of wastewater on a distributed basis, with the balance being offered to City Council as a one-time contribution to support septic tank phase-out. And before I invite comment from the board, I'll ask our guest, Councilman Schellenberg, to weigh in with his thoughts and perspective from City Council. Mr. Schellenberg?
First of all, thank you very much, Chair, for inviting me to this conversation. I'm dealing with 18 other people, including the mayor, so I'm pretty sure they're not necessarily on everybody's page, and we come to different perspective about how to go about it. When I heard Mr. Zahn willingness to talk to the board about the $15 million, I actually asked the Public Works Department about the money that we've gotten so far, how many homes it has affected. And the answer is it's very few homes have been affected going forward. A couple reasons. Number one is it's rebuilding infrastructure. You're building down the roads. There's a lot of, because these are older neighborhoods, there's a lot more construction, a lot more costs involved in connecting them. The original proposal, I think, was they're going to just go down the street and you have to get, the numbers, not sure, but I think they have to get 65, 70? 70 of the neighborhood to buy into it. And several neighborhoods were very difficult to do this until one of the, my colleagues said, we'll not only get them, but we'll actually make the connection, spend some money from the house to the main line. I think the mayor's indicated that he wants to proceed with this, but I think we should proceed with caution. Maybe put it off and put it as a contingency that if the council and the finance committee over the next 60 days thinks it's a great idea and is willing to do it, then you can release the money. But I think that there should be a little bit more conversation about the other opportunities that JEA could use for the money going forward. I understand the capital costs going forward, the future needs of JEA, and I would say it's not an immediate need going forward. The council can debate it over the next 6 weeks in regards to if it's urgent. Not only urgent, if they could take the money and actually implement any of these things in the next year or 9 months. And that's something I did not get an answer back from our Public Works Department going forward. So those are my opinions only, but I greatly appreciate the chair allowing me to speak on the other possibilities going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Schellenberg. Let me ask, Nancy, do you know how many homes have been converted in the most recent JEA COJ septic phase-out effort?
None yet. Is there someone?
So, to be fair, the 70% threshold was just met a number of months ago, which would have kicked off then engineering and planning. So when she says none, it's more a function of time.
None have been converted yet, but how many have been approved in the neighborhoods that have hit the 70% threshold?
So probably about 1,500 units. So we've gotten 2 neighborhoods that have agreed and reached the 70%. The first neighborhood is in design, and hopefully there'll be a construction package going out in March of 19. We're in the process of selecting design firm on the second neighborhood, which is a little bigger.
And this 15 million is estimated to be about 600 to 800 additional homes that would be impacted.
That's where I was going next, to anticipate my follow-up question. Okay. So this could conceivably impact 600, 800 additional
Customers.
units, customers. Okay, I'll open it up for questions. Again, thank you. The suggestion was that, suggestion from staff is that the proceeds from the sale of the South Side Generating Station site be dedicated, at least primarily, to septic tank phase-out. Ms. Flanagan, thoughts?
I don't have a formed opinion or conclusion on the topic. I know that it's one that's, very important to the city, our community, our customers. At face value, it seems like a positive thing that the organization and utility can do. I might query what the reasons against doing this would be so that, there could be a debate for and against, but I haven't necessarily thought of any on my own.
Thank you, Ms. Flanagan. Mr. Wanamaker, What would happen to the proceeds, or they're currently unbudgeted revenue, what would happen to the proceeds if we didn't dispose of them through this offer to city council?
So it would go into our R&R fund, and it would be used for capital,
Thank you. Other capital improvements?
other capital improvements. That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Cumber?
So in our last extension of the JEA agreement with the city, Jody, maybe this is a question for you. Can you remind me what the contribution was that we made that was then ultimately used for septic tank?
So we put in 15 million, and
Okay.
it was matched 15 million by the city.
So, here's kind of where my head is number one, I appreciate the thought put into this. It would have been helpful to also say, here are the 10 things we considered, right? Here's why we're not doing these 9, and we think this is the best return on investment for JEA. So to come in and say, here's our idea, and not giving the board the benefit of actually understanding the thought that went through it, makes it difficult to, for me to say, let's just sign on and go. I think for clarity, for this board's purpose, and Jody, correct me if I'm wrong, we cannot send money to the city and earmark it for septic tank conversions. We can send money to the city of Jacksonville, and then Councilmember Schellenberg and his colleagues and the mayor can make a decision on where that money ends up getting spent.
Right. We can make suggestions as to where
Make
it could be
suggestions, right,
spent,
but we can't
not
earmark
putting
it,
in-
correct. So in my view,
Excuse me, that's how the last septic tank legislation was characterized?
It was established, it was $15 million for the city to be able to use it, but the idea that they would use it for septic tank phase out.
because
We'd actually have
because
to amend the
because-
existing agreement.
Because Chair Howard, when I was on, I think I was the only one on the board at the time, there was one of the former board members made a comment that they would like to see something like this happen. And then managing director and CEO said, Mr. McElroy said, we can't do that, right? So when I think back to the fact that we made this $15 million kind of one-time contribution, it was in the framework of the overall agreement, right? And so what, unfortunately, Ms. Dykes isn't here today, right?
No.
She's on
Okay.
vacation, we allowed it.
So, what kind of rings in the back of my mind is, for months, and I think Mr. Hightower was then chair, that, we can't afford another dollar of contribution to the city, right? And that was like a very solid line. But in any negotiation on an agreement extension, both sides have to come to a middle ground. And so for me to sit here and say, we're going to spend another $15 million that goes to the city, but not have it be part of an overall conversation of what does that mean for JEA's contribution, I think we're missing an opportunity to say, look, we're willing to consider this, but we also have an extension that, or an agreement that ends on a date certain that needs to be extended. And if you don't match those up, I don't feel comfortable having the other side of the table say, don't worry, we won't forget that you did this. Because people change, right? Board members change, council members change. And so I think we need to look at this, if we are going to go down this path and decide we're not going to use that money for JEA's CapEx, one, I'd like to understand what it would have gone to if we would have kept it. But two, I'd like to understand how we're going to approach this from an overall JEA City of Jacksonville contribution agreement. And at minimum, I'd like to see that at least get extended so we know what the ceiling would be for several more years, especially when we just saw a financial scorecard that showed that water revenues are coming down, electric revenues are staying flat. I don't think it'd be smart for us to do it without the larger conversation.
Yeah. And water revenues are actually increasing, just they're not matching the goal that was outpaced.
Right, which
but
feeds
your
CapEx
point
and
being,
everything else.
your point is mechanically, I think, this is a proposal that was one in concept only, the mechanics of which, just to remind the board, if JEA could expand its effectively undertake septic tank phase out by itself by utilizing these proceeds, it would. But we can't actually offer the connection fees at a different price than our other customers. So that's why mechanically this money would have to go to the city of Jacksonville and then eventually would come back to JEA. I think the point on working with the city council and the city representatives to ensure that that there in fact would be a return on that investment through some sort of contract is a very good one, and one that perhaps not laid out in this letter was conceptualized and have an agreement with.
And then the last thing I would say is I'm conceptually trying to figure out why we would approve the 15 million, but be having a study being done to tell us what the best way to tackle this issue would be, and not have the study done saying, here's how you tackle the issue, and then we say, here's the first 15 million down payment against that solution.
Sure.
So, to me, that seems a little backwards, but those are my initial reactions.
Ms. Green?
I think after hearing the discussion and hearing from City Council, it's I think of the public. This is an issue that has been kind of floating around since the Better Jacksonville plan, and I think that with the uncertainty of the initial 15 million that was given and the phase out has not been completed, that there needs to be caution moving forward before JEA contributes another 15 million. I think that we owe it to the public to be sure that we will be moving forward, what that cost will be, and the timeline of when that will happen. So I would be hesitant to move forward with that contribution without having more specifics and some guarantee for the public.
Ms. Johnson?
I'm interested in the follow-up from here. It is information at this point, but getting some more facts behind the context will be helpful for me in just how we move forward.
Mr. Campion?
I actually agree with that. New subject. Obviously, sanitation is very important, and it's a long way from A to B. So understanding, getting a bit more information would certainly be helpful.
So just so I'm clear on the consensus of the board, no action today, but we would like to get some additional information from staff that speaks to alternative uses, timing on the outcome of the current study, and the really details around the current conversions and conversion rate and cost. Anything else that we'd be looking for from staff?
I'd also like to see a proposal as to how it would fit with our current agreement.
Thank you.
Contribution agreement.
Yep.
I appreciate that direction from the board, and again, perhaps this is a difference in the method of interaction of staff with the board than in past part of the JEA's existence. Hopefully you can appreciate wanting to effectively put out a balloon of an idea and a concept before taking a ton of time as staff to fully develop something, so that we're really focusing our time and attention on the things that have the greatest impact. So I guess what I'm hearing is you do want to take the next step, in which we will flesh out a plan and work through the mechanics and come back with those answers. And otherwise, if the board was so inclined, we can take the idea and just put it back on a shelf. But I just want to make sure I'm absolutely clear.
I think we want more information before we vote up or down.
Okay.
Is that fair? Yes? Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you,
Great.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilman. Okay, last item under strategy, just a quick transition plan update.
Yep, we are on plan. You'll notice that there's one item that I just chose not to undertake, which is engaging a third-party drive CEO transition. Just didn't feel it was a necessary expenditure at this time, and that we're making very good headway relative to the transition and getting senior leadership moving in the right direction along with the entire company and community. I appreciate the board's work on this and look forward to continuing.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Zahn. The next item on our agenda is the review of the data fiber utility services for the 22nd century city.
Yeah, and as the team is coming up, again, subject matter exploration, this section of the board is intended to be more educational and talk about market trends and ideas, given that, we are in a number of complex markets, and hope you enjoy.
Mr. Cosgrave, who do you have with you?
Ryan.
I know him.
Ryan's going to do our introduction of our speaker. I'm just going to give you a little background on the subject and then turn it over
Please.
to Ryan. I'm Paul Cosgrave. I'm the Chief Information Officer. Going to give you a background, especially for the new board members, because we have discussed this topic previously here at the board. If you look at the agenda item, the summary item, which is on page 5A, it gives you the background on this topic. And today what we're going to do is we're going to utilize our new process here, a three-step process of first discussing one of these topics, which is what we're going to do today. Then we'll give you an opportunity at a future meeting to deliberate on it and then ultimately decide. We had made some decisions to move forward on this previously, but we had the board rescind that because the program we put forward at the time was a fairly small effort to do this, and we're thinking a lot bigger now, which you'll hear from our speaker. We have many assets which are relevant to providing telecommunications services. We have over 180,000 poles, 30-plus cell towers, and 550 miles of dark fiber. And there is unused capacity within those assets. Our charter today restricts us to only being allowed to lease these unused assets to other parties. We cannot invest in additional capacity unless it's directly to support our own core business. I'll note that we have an opportunity for JEA also to take a leadership role here in Jacksonville to help Jacksonville become a smart city. And if we do that, it would actually involve some fairly significant investments in the basic infrastructure, broadband infrastructure in the city. And so finally, I'll just leave you one thought. The City Council Special Committee on the Future of JEA recognized in their final report in June that because of the success of energy conservation measures in reducing electric and water consumption and sales, the JEA needs to consider expanding its operations into related business lines to diversify its revenue streams and ensure continued financial health. So on that note, I'll turn you over to Ryan, who will do the introduction of our speaker.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. As Paul mentioned, we're looking at this on a broader scale than we were previously, particularly, again, in the framework of the value strategic framework. Value to the customer, it expands value to the customer by an expansion of broadband in the community. From a financial value perspective, it increases net income and free cash flow to monetize a key non-core asset and provide for growth capital. And it also provides community impact and environmental value by allowing JEA to jumpstart smart city initiatives and providing connectivity throughout the region. And so our speaker today is Jason Gerdell. Jason is the head of the Infrastructure Advisory Group at J.P. Morgan. He's 19 years of experience in the telecom and utility sectors, covering corporate and public entities. He's worked on several successful telecom and fiber monetization efforts, including efforts for a variety of clients, including CPS Energy and the state of Hawaii. Jason?
Thanks, Ryan. Chairman.
Thank you for being here.
Board, thank you very much for having us. So am I flipping this way?
Yeah.
You don't need to see the disclaimer. So we'll start by talking a little bit about the broadband landscape, and one of the things that's become clear in the recent past is what we say is that broadband has become our fourth utility. It's as important to our market as electricity was 100 years ago. And the issue that we're running into is obviously the infrastructure and the support, and the lack of broadband in certain communities and environments is a detriment to economic development. It's a detriment to community development, and it's certainly, when there's an owned asset, it's a detriment to creating value for JEA in the community. So if you flip to the next slide, so why are we talking about communications in one of the largest utilities in the U.S., certainly public utilities in the U.S.? And it's because communications is core to delivering safe, reliable electricity and water for any utility. And so years ago, obviously, JEA deployed a fiber network and a wireless network solely for the purpose of internal communications, monitoring remote sensors, and that asset has effectively created capacity and commercial interest. So as the communication market continued to evolve over the years, these assets and obviously the JEA market, the Jacksonville MSA, became very interesting to a lot of the communications providers, and they approached the company. And today, the excess capacity that is not used for JEA for the purposes of delivering utilities is leased to commercial providers. And that's why we're talking about it today, is you have a meaningful asset that is capable of delivering commercial services. So if you turn to back to Paul and Ryan's opening comments, obviously in March there was a discussion around how do you unlock that value, how do you approach it. This is a significant asset. And today I think that the key differences that we'll be talking about are, so going from just expanding the entity and continuing to focus on the utility and the telecom business being an extension of that, this is to repurpose and to focus on the asset and on developing the asset for the community, for developing the asset for economic development purposes, for the asset for the wellness of the citizens of Jacksonville, and certainly to deliver more value. Obviously, I've been sitting in the crowd and listening to some of the challenges the business goes through. Obviously, we're very close to the business. Customers are using less utility. They're using less water. They're using less electricity. And so as they function as a potential source of revenue and a source of funding. And certainly one of the biggest challenges in most instances is reducing risk. As we'll talk about today, the communications industry is evolving. To the extent that JEA doesn't take advantage of this asset, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast will. And because these are long-term contracts, you risk overbuilding. This still is a core asset of JEA. It's incredibly important to SmartGrid. Being able to have this as a sustainable resource for the future is going to be very important to the operations. So I think we touched on most of these, but I think very important. Obviously, it starts with the utility. This was a core function for the utility. It then goes to broadband as a logical extension. Utility services, water, electricity fall along the same veins as do broadband services. And so it's a critical piece of developing broadband. It's obviously a critical piece of community development, wellness, education, healthcare, and more informed and educated population, certainly. Economic development, I'm sure you've seen and read cases of bringing in infrastructure, bringing in fiber, bringing in wireless services to bring more corporations and certainly have those facilities available. And from a financial standpoint, obviously, we talked about the potential. From a globalization standpoint, obviously, Jacksonville sits at a critical juncture in the United States. It is a large, obviously, transportation hub. It's a large communications hub. And so this is developing the infrastructure and being able to access those resources is also going to put Jacksonville more on a global stage and certainly will position it for the future. So I think we talked about, we'll call it the supply side. You have a very, very important asset, certainly for the purposes of delivering the utility. And I think we've also established the fact that there's going to be, there's a significant opportunity. The question is, where is this coming from? And where it's coming from is a lot of the things that are sitting in the room, the cameras, the devices, streaming video, social media. The internet is exploding, and the ways that we're accessing it are exploding, and the infrastructure is not available today. And so I think you've got what we would characterize as a perfect storm, where you have, I'll give you an example. If JEA went from 13 million megawatt hours of production or sales to 26 million megawatt hours over the course of 5 years, it would change everything about the way the business was managed, and that's what we're effectively looking at in the communication space. And so we have an infrastructure that isn't capable of handling the growth, and organizations and companies like JEA that have access to those resources that are being approached and obviously can be leveraged to deliver a lot of the infrastructure we're looking for. So again, this touches on a number of the points. You've got growth across every major category. And we're not talking about insignificant growth. You're talking about 4 and 5 times the growth. Now, one of the key points that doesn't come out in this slide that I think for folks that live here, Jacksonville is not wanting for broadband. It actually, based on the Federal Communications view of what is effective broadband, Jacksonville does very well. I think the issue that we're running into is that the definition of broadband is changing significantly. It was 2 megabits, and it was 25 megabits, and the truth of the matter is even at 100 megabits, which the FCC qualifies Jacksonville as actually having almost 99% coverage, that's not going to deal with the future. And so at 1 gigabit of service, which is more consistent with what is probably going to be the kind of the standard in the next 5 to 10 years, the city of Jacksonville is the fiber that underpins that. It's about 2 or 3%. And so you can see that while there's a lot of discussion around the fact that there's significant broadband in the city of Jacksonville, the truth of the matter is there won't be in 10 years. So this is this oversimplifies the infrastructure today, but you've effectively got metro fiber providers, organizations that are providing fiber services. You have data centers, and then you have tower companies. And these organizations all basically make up the fabric of communications infrastructure. JEA is selling services to these organizations. Long-term contracts, very, very high cash flow margins, significant growth, and really are the fabric of solving the problems that we were just discussing. Excuse me one second. So the key here is you've got a situation where JEA effectively is enabling each one of these organizations within the city of Jacksonville. Not only are they selling these organizations service, they're also providing the infrastructure upon which a lot of these services are created. So this is really the fabric, and again, this is an overly simplified view of the market. But if you look at the pieces and the components, it is very, very fair to assume that the infrastructure that exists at JEA is a huge portion of the fabric of the service providers that provide infrastructure in the city of Jacksonville. So that was dealing not exclusively with the fiber, but a good portion of the fiber. Wireless communications is obviously it's changing not just the fabric of how we're communicating, but also the need for more fiber. As an aside, so when a wireless provider needs to build its network, it puts radios on pieces of infrastructure of altitude, rooftops, cell towers, and the idea is that more of those should equate to better service. And so what you're finding now is these infrastructure issues and the growth, there is just not enough. There's just not enough infrastructure. And so if flip to the next slide. So quickly, the evolution of communications, we're all the way to the right. We went from what we would call a 3G environment to the middle, which is a 4G environment, which is where we started to see much, much faster data speeds, to the last, which is where we are today, which is the finalization or the continued fill-in on the 4G wireless networks, and importantly, the deployment of 5G. And why is this important to JEA? If you see these gray boxes, effectively what this is the lack of infrastructure. This is the infrastructure that historically didn't exist. And so a tower company or a wireless provider spent the vast majority of the last 40 years using private property, using private infrastructure the realization of the fourth generation, and certainly in the fifth generation, is that public infrastructure was going to be critical to the development. You needed to fill in these spots. You needed to make sure that the radios were there, and the absence of these radios was a detriment to the network. These are the areas where JEA has infrastructure. They're in the form of transmission lines. They're in the form of existing telecommunications lines. They're in the form of fiber. They're in the form of wireless towers. So this is where the opportunity is going to exist. And again, it's a significant opportunity, and one where if you speak to a carrier, they'll say that the history and what we've done for the last century and the wireless carriers for the last 50 years will not address the needs for the fifth generation wireless, which is why partnerships with large public utilities, with states, with municipalities, and having an ability to blanket an environment rather than go off and do single contracts is really what it's going to be about. So the next slide is a little bit more of that. You have effectively the infrastructure that we're used to seeing from the utility, transmission lines, distribution lines, rooftops that obviously exist regardless of whether it's a utility, street furniture and light poles. Street furniture and light poles, believe it or not, are going to be a very, very important part of wireless communication. The idea being that before you would go from one major cell site, drive 3 or 4 miles, and it would pick you up to the next one. Now you could end up walking 3 or 4 meters on the street and have that same type of relationship, but now using street furniture. And so you can see that there are very few organizations comprehensively that can address what is going to be a very, very significant need. And obviously, the city of Jacksonville and JEA and its infrastructure do that very nicely. So let's talk a little bit about the components of the market. Again, the top of our 3 publicly traded tower companies. So these organizations provide wireless infrastructure, wireless towers for the co-location of wireless equipment. The bottom 2 is a subset. This isn't the complete fiber market, but these are 2 that provide metro fiber communications. And so if you look at the valuations, EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, and amortization, it's effectively operating cash flow. These organizations continue to trade at very, very attractive levels. The tower industry at mid-20s, and the fiber industry at about 15. Again, these are publicly traded comps. Valuations for the purchase of assets tend to be significantly higher. And put it in concept. So the top part, our 3 public companies, that's $180 billion of enterprise value across 3 organizations where their asset base, and trying to equate this to the electric industry, their asset base is probably order of magnitude 20. So $20 billion of net plant is capable of generating almost $180 billion of market value. So every new dollar of capital that's deployed, levered appropriately, is generating that type of value in the market. Not completely the same in the fiber space, about double that, so 3 times. So obviously the capital markets are rewarding investment, and these organizations are driving a good portion of the market. So let's quickly talk about, so JEA is, the telecom services is comprised of two basic components. One is obviously the dark fiber business, which we talked about earlier. The other is co-location. And co-location, in simplest form, is leasing space on infrastructure for the purposes of wireless communication, or for JEA's business also, for the carriers who are co-locating on distribution poles. And so those are the 2 pieces of their business. Those two components of the business are generating close to $8 million, $9 million in revenue, and significant cash flow. So the other interesting part about the business, high fixed cost, obviously, high invested cost. In JEA's case, obviously, a lot of this investment was made to support the utility, but very low variable cost. And so significant cash flow from the business, and significant opportunity to be able to continue to grow the business. So back to the map. Again, the assets and how comprehensive they are really reside in the fact that you've got transmission infrastructure 7,000 miles. And so opportunities to be able to co-locate wireless equipment, opportunities to continue to use rights of way to distribute fiber. And this is all in addition to the fact that there's already infrastructure in place. There's already close to $10 million of revenue. There's close to 60 licenses in place or leases in place right now, and an opportunity to continue to expand on what has already been a fairly successful program. So put this in context and to put a little bit more detail around it. The pole co-location revenue is, again, these are your distribution poles and lashing fiber and infrastructure to those poles and being paid a lease for that. Two is the wireless co-location. Again, that's putting radios on JEA's infrastructure and paying JEA monthly rent for the lease. And then the last is the dark fiber. So we keep saying dark fiber. Dark fiber is exactly the way it sounds. It is fiber optics that has not been lit, and that is so that when you lease it to somebody or when you sell it to somebody, it gives them the opportunity to put the electronics on it and do what they want with the fiber. And so it's low cost in terms of variable cost, very high margin, and obviously a big portion of the business. That's today. If you look at the potential market, we talked about a lot of these, and this is really to show, if you're starting from right to left, this goes from residential, so the services we have at home, all the way to co-location on towers. If you go from the bottom to the top, we're looking at value and the uniqueness of the asset. JEA's business spans a number of very, very attractive markets in one of the largest communications markets in the U.S. And so again, a significant opportunity to deal with a number of those logos on the page and be able to provide them with services and facilitate the delivery of broadband, wireless and fixed in Jacksonville. So here's a good example of a recent case. So Crown Castle is the largest U.S. tower company. Crown Castle, from the years 2013 to 2016, deployed about 850 radios, small cell radios, so smaller radios rather than the big radios you see on towers, and about 150 miles of fiber. So over the course of 3 years, they effectively built out an infrastructure and this is, if you look at this, is 2016, so this is pre-new wireless, this is pre-5G. This would have still been for a 4G development. This is probably $12, $15 million of revenue, significant infrastructure, and what is not the complete build out of the MSA, and a situation that is very similar to what we're looking at today, except today we have the advent of a 5G network. You have a market that's I'd say is just as robust as Chicago, and an opportunity to take something that looks like this and with the appropriate direction, potentially have this is a single opportunity. This isn't the full. This is obviously not the full crown. This is just one project that they were working on, which leads to how do we take advantage of the situation. So obviously there is a real opportunity to leverage the infrastructure that's in place today to create economic and community development initiatives, certainly to continue to provide for the utility. And one of the things that we want to I keep reminding myself of is this is still very critical to JEA's business. JEA is an inflection point. Smart grid is going to change everything about the way they do business. Distributed generation, which we talked about. This fiber network and this wireless infrastructure is going to be necessary for that. So protecting that for the future, making sure that the potential value and revenue that we talked about earlier and the valuation in the marketplace is developed, and simply expanding on the investment that's already been made and unlocking that investment and unlocking that value for JEA and for the city of Jacksonville. So why, I think we touched on these, but just hit them quickly again, is what's going to be the interest from the community, the partner? Very similar to the same interest that comes from the partners and the folks that are using the asset today. Strategically located fiber. Obviously, Jacksonville is a top 50. It's a top 50 communications market. It's one of the largest markets, certainly it's the largest city in the United States. It's one of the largest communications markets in the United States. You have over 1.5 million, obviously, distinct users, one of the largest business and industrial centers in the country, and sits obviously at a junction point in the southeastern United States for communications. If I was a provider, this is a place that I'd want to be. And interesting part is there isn't anybody that has the infrastructure that JEA does to be able to provide these services. Obviously, significant growth potential, 7,000 miles of infrastructure. I don't think that you can overstate that enough times. If you talk to a carrier, to be able to have access to 7,000 miles in a single corridor throughout a metropolitan area, that's going to be very, very valuable in the future. And the growth. Again, when you're talking about the numbers on the water system and the electric system, obviously there's a lot to replace. There's a lot to support. But if this begins today, you have the benefit of picking up that cash flow, that growth that you may be losing from the utility, but you also have the benefit of making sure that the infrastructure is available for the community itself. So go back to our map. So where is the opportunity? I think the first is obviously we've got a 550-mile network today. That is, when compared to 7,000 miles of rights-of-way and transmission infrastructure, obviously there's an opportunity to expand the network itself. There's an opportunity to expand the capacity of the network, to provide more fiber, to put more fiber into the network that exists today, effectively increasing the services that are available today. So we've been talking about dark fiber. By connecting electronics to that fiber network, you have the ability to go and provide lit services, which again is another source of revenue, most likely developed by a partner, but still with the type of infrastructure that you have today. Being able to light those services and provide an extra source of revenue is going to be important. Continue to lease up the towers. The current towers are fairly full. That's the right way to say it. But continuing to develop towers and putting more revenue on new towers, taking advantage of JEA's real estate portfolio, taking advantage of the transmission infrastructure. These are significant opportunities. We go back to the Chicago example. Small cell. Again, back to the Chicago example. There's a large backlog of potential opportunities. It would not be surprising if that type of a situation, going from 350 nodes to 1,000 nodes in the city of Jacksonville, and to be able to provide those services will be important. And the last one, obviously, is you have one of only a couple landing stations for submarine cable in the world, and certainly in the United States. And so this is where we talk about the hub and being able to communicate not just throughout the community, which your transportation, obviously your air infrastructure, but you also have one of the few hubs in the South Atlantic to be able to connect to the south, certainly, and these are, some of these lines are ancient. Some of these lines have been around for 40 or 50 years. And so what you're going to see as these continue to develop, you're going to see a lot more traffic, and New York, a lot of our traffic, obviously, in the North Atlantic goes through New York, and they're looking for redundancy. It's important for redundancy. The next generation of submarine fiber is going to need redundancy, and Jacksonville is a perfect hub for that. So I'd say there's three basic options that we looked at a very high level. In the status quo, you have a meaningful asset. You have an exceptional management team, and an opportunity, certainly, to continue down the path that you're on today. You retain the cash flow. You retain any upside. You certainly retain control of the asset. The flip side is that this is not the business of JEA. This is a utility. And bringing in a potential partner here to unlock the value, and not just unlock the value, but to invest. There's obviously a significant amount of investment that could go into the network, and to be able to bring in a partner to do that is going to be important. From a partnership and a sales standpoint, so a partnership would be a traditional public-private partnership, and that could take a number of different forms. We'll leave it as a partnership where an operator comes in and leverages the assets that exist today. They invest in the assets. They effectively utilize their sales force, their infrastructure to develop the asset, and make the resources available while JEA and the city maintain control and obviously ownership of the asset. The challenge is there is you don't completely relieve yourselves of the risks associated with the business. There's obviously retention of the and valuing. How do you value that? Do you get full value for that? And importantly, how do you define the contract? What does the P3 look like? Making sure that you get a wish list, and that wish list continues not just to be for the services that we're talking about today, but also the economic development and for community development. And the last one is the asset sale, the complete sale of the asset. Tends to be the highest, at least upfront proceeds, ability to generate cash. I think the challenge here is just the ability to sell the asset. It's critical infrastructure. It's critical to the utility. It's obviously critical to the city. I would argue that there would be certain challenges from a legal standpoint to be able to separate the asset. The loss of control, the loss of the ability to actually make the resource available to the community and do the things that aren't necessarily directly related to the utility. So those are the three general paths that we've seen in the past, and certainly are available in the market. We talked a little bit about these names, but these are the different players and the different service providers that would be absolutely involved in the discussions. We don't need to get into the logos as much as thinking about these various industries and the components of the communication space. The fiber infrastructure, we talked about a number of these logos. Obviously, the cable industry. So the cable industry is obviously a big user of fiber, Comcast in particular in Jacksonville. But as the cable industry continues to look at commercial services, these could potentially be partners. Overbuilder, the one overbuilder on the page is Google. And given Google's history, certainly would be very, very interesting to see them return to the table if there was fiber available. ILEC is the incumbent, and you know and love them. AT&T, CenturyLink, which is now part of Level 3, Verizon and Windstream, and then the tower companies. And the tower companies really, the way we look at the tower companies are the big nationals, the public vertical bridge, which is the largest private in the U.S., and then the regionals, which are good operators, but just tend to have operations that are more regionally focused. And then the last are actual land management. So rights-of-way aggregators, organizations that are focused on taking and developing rights-of-way, and obviously, given the situation, very, very valuable and would be an important part of a potential partnership. So this goes back to what have we seen in the past, and I think that certainly the situation and the approach, if you go back to Paul's opening comments and Ryan's around going from what was focus of the March 18 proposal and what we're talking about today, it is unique. And these track along the same path that we were just talking about, from organizations that continue to own and operate their own networks and provide services, organizations that actually have focused on a private option. I'll distinguish between, there's a private option where a Google Fiber comes in, develops your network, provides the service, but you haven't sold anything to them, versus the two logos on the page, which you probably recognize from the sector, CPS and LCRA, where they sold their wireless infrastructure to a provider. And that provider effectively manages their radios, but then uses and bought those assets outright to provide services. To the last, which is the more classic partnership. And the logos here are there's a number of different approaches and opportunities from the city of Boston that entered into an agreement which is not dissimilar to what we would hope for to see from JEA, which is a provider came in and took over their wireless assets, will pay them a revenue, a portion of their revenue to develop it. Anytime they go to build out fiber, they will give the city a portion of that fiber, so effectively grant them fiber when they pull fiber to a Kentucky Wired, which was a very, very ambitious middle mile fiber network in the state of Kentucky. A $400 million project to effectively bring a broadband network for government anchor organizations in Kentucky with a private operator and an investment and a handback in 30 years. So in terms of a process, so I think the one thing that we wanted to make very clear is that the form of a potential partnership or a partnership at all is still to be determined. What we know is that the asset is incredibly valuable. What we know is that it's an important part of the fabric of JEA and certainly the community. What we don't know is whether or not you're going to find a partner and an opportunity that addresses the goals and objectives. And so I think that the first part of this would be obviously preparation and market sounding. Depending and obviously subject to procurement rules for JEA, that could come in the form of interviews or an RFI. And then obviously being able to prepare to go and actually put whether it's a qualification, so RFQs to go out and actually once we get an RFI back and we find a potential path and some options to go out and actually qualify the market. So go back and look at the names that would potentially be good partners. Then to obviously execute the actual RFP. So what are the proposals that would be available in the market? What are the key components of those? Running a full RFP, reporting back obviously to this group and to the community. What potential options are there for developing this asset, and then obviously close. And close is one where close and manage and maintain. Obviously, one of the most important parts of a P3 or any project is how are you going to monitor and maintain, and who's going to oversee the actual deployment and the management of the process and the project going forward. So again, I think in conclusion, obviously this is an important part of JEA and will continue to be regardless of whatever project or plan you decide to pursue. It will be an important part of broadband infrastructure in the city of Jacksonville, no question. It's going to continue to be a necessary component of being able to deliver the services. In terms of community development, obviously, from a well-being of the Jacksonville citizens, from healthcare to education, to just general utility and functionality, to economic development, being able to bring larger corporations in and having those corporations continue to evolve, to be able to continue to expand the potential opportunities for the city, and then obviously globalization. I don't think that we're exaggerating by saying that this is an important link to the outside world, and having access to and providing and having the world see your citizens, your services, your labor, and certainly the community on a global scale is obviously very important. And then from, we talked quite a bit about this today, obviously. We don't know what the size of the opportunity is, but assume that it's meaningful. In a world where the utility is going to look very different in the next 20 years, the cash flow that these types of projects generate is beneficial. It's high growth, it's high margin, it's very, very low, very low churn, and certainly would be very beneficial to JEA going forward. With that, I am going to stop talking and open it for questions.
Jason, take a well-deserved drink of water. Thank you very much for this very thorough presentation. I read it when it came out last week. I read it again yesterday, and I followed along closely. I'm still not sure I understand it all. But I do understand that these assets are underutilized. As you may know, the City Council here in Jacksonville recently concluded a committee on the future of JEA, and one of their findings and mandates to JEA and this board were to explore opportunities for revenue. This is certainly an important and critical asset for JEA, but one that represents some untapped sources of revenue potentially. So it's certainly something we're going to give a lot of thought to. It's not presented as an action item. It's presented really sort of for issue of first impression, not to in any way short sell the March presentation, which was far more of an incremental opportunity proposal. But I'm going to open it up for discussion by the board members, questions, mindful of the time, to see if there's an opportunity for us to engage in further discussion with J.P. Morgan and Jason and his team going forward, but get initial questions out now. Mr. Zahn?
May I summarize Jason's kind of conversation and maybe
Sure.
bring some clarity to the entire board? So what we're talking about is JEA currently possesses 550 miles of dark fiber, 30-plus cell towers, 180,000 vertical pieces of infrastructure, all of which are the necessary backbone for wireless and communication infrastructure, which, as you can see, is growing at 20 times over the next 5 years. In March, when JEA was looking at that business model, we were looking at incremental growth, predominantly because we're not a sales company, as well as the need to invest our own capital in order to be able to take advantage of that market. So compare going from about $9 million in revenue to $12 million in revenue in a market that's going from 10 to 200 in the same period of time. You're just not keeping up with the pace. So that shows you the historical approach was one of more holistic organic growth, and the reality is we're not a sales engine in the communication space. We're not. We have a very good team, but not an entire multi-billion-dollar platform dedicated to it. And so what we're talking about here is really looking at it more from a partnership approach, where potentially we can monetize a portion of the asset up front, meaning bring in cash day one, as well as have a partner that drives the value of those assets faster, and we participate in the profitability going forward. So that's the difference in the approach. And Jason was giving an overview on the market, the supply, the demand functions. I think the innovation on the approach, and one, Jason, you can tell me, no city in the United States has ever taken this holistic of an approach relative to offering the horizontal and vertical assets all in one fell swoop package to the market.
That's correct. That's correct, and it is unique in that it is a functioning, operating fiber network, wireless network, and it also, obviously, to your point, is it's going to be an important part of the infrastructure going forward.
So then you layer on top of that the easements that we currently have, the transmission lines, and all the other things that basically can be layered into this, and you have a very valuable asset in a very fast-growing market. On top of that, the City Council has been talking about the aesthetics and having control. Here you then have a partner where you have one commercial partner that you can maintain aesthetic and environmental control over the deployment of those assets so that you don't have a piecemeal patchwork deployment for communication. That's the summary.
Thanks for that recap. Ms. Flanagan.
No questions.
Mr. Comber.
So help me understand, and I appreciate that summary. recognize we don't have the sales force, but, and I know we're short on time, so maybe I'll ask you to come back with us with almost like a snapshot of what FPL did with FPL FiberNet. Because obviously they felt the ability to build it organically and then monetize it at a certain point after growth, right? And so I'd like to understand that.
Sure.
And understand the trade-off between monetizing on day one and letting a partner grow it, and kind of taking the approach that FP&L did by incubating FPL FiberNet
Sure.
and then monetizing it.
And certainly I will follow up, and we can talk a little bit more about that. We were very much involved in that for close to a decade. And we'll tell you that the development of that was very much FPL getting into the telecom business. They were in the telecom business. They were providing lit services. There was a full management team. There's a full sales force.
Did they provide lit as well?
They did.
They did, okay.
They did, yeah.
Okay.
It wasn't as significant, obviously, but it certainly was, it was something that they got into. That was a situation where there was a conscious decision to obviously continue to push forward. And when valuations got to the point where they did, which was, $1.5 billion, it was an important time to trade the asset. So I think that the one thing that Aaron has mentioned, and we would obviously encourage, is there's got to be some type of retention of the upside, because to all of our points, this is an underpenetrated and underutilized asset. Selling it now is effectively selling the upside for someone else to benefit from, retaining a portion of the upside. No different than if you kept an equity position, but retaining revenue, retaining fiber. That is the one way you would protect it in the absence of going out and recreating, FPL FiberNet in the city of Jacksonville, which again puts you in the telecom business. So it's those things in the structure that allows you to maintain some amount of control and certainly maintain some of the upside. Because I'm sure that if FPL had sold that in 2006 and 2007, when they were originally thinking about it, they would have left close to $800 million on the table.
And then the last question is, as part of preparing for this presentation, did you take a look at what we do charge right now for fiber leases, dark fiber, and
No.
whether or not we're charging market rate?
No, we haven't gone to that point, and I will say that we've done detailed studies on that, and I will tell you that it's very challenging to say what market is. We've gotten into this discussion and the debate, and somebody says, well, that's not really market. And it says, well, there's not a lot of comps out there for public utility fiber. It's clear that they're not necessarily charging market, and then the question for the group is, what is the market for it today? If you said a small cell antenna, you would get a dozen different answers from some very, very smart people. If you said, what's the right price to charge for dark fiber in the city of Jacksonville, you'd probably get a number of different answers. And so I think that's the challenge of saying whether it's market or not, is to go out, and by the way, that could be part of the question when you go out and say, in the RFI, what do you think the potential is? What do you think the opportunity is? And now you probably won't get a competitive answer from any of the providers. But what you're going to get is you're going to get revenue assumptions, and you're going to get revenue projections, and you're going to get the things that you can imply. This is what they'd be willing to sell those services for. So.
Okay.
Thank you, Jason. Ms. Green?
None.
Ms. Johnson?
No questions.
Mr. Campion?
Very informative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so.
I think I'll read this 2 or 3 times more.
Exactly right.
And I'll leave the board with, for me, this is less about JE being in the telecom business and more about us being focused on our core business, which is energy and water. So, and then the second is, the path we were on, we were going to compete head-to-head with the people in this presentation. I'd rather partner and let them do what they're great at, and we'll do what we're great at. And if we were, the alternative on the holistic model is we have to staff up, acquire the talent, maintain the talent, invest the CapEx, hope that we can sell and compete directly head-to-head against the people in this presentation, versus the alternative, which is some layer of gray between some element of partnership to full divestiture, and without making any recommendation, laying off the risk as well as finding a way to bring in cash and then allow our team, senior team, to be focused on the businesses that are dynamic in and of themselves, which are the energy and the water sectors, as we hear you here talk about, and without having to figure out what is market pricing relative to telco, because generally speaking, that is a very complex question that, while we have a very experienced team, we probably need a whole platform in order to figure it out and be able to be nationwide understanding those dynamics. So to me, it's less about the actual specifics of the business and more about the division of where you spend most of your time as a company generating value.
Thank you, Mr. Zahn. I indicated I have a number of questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to submit those in writing. I'll submit them to Mr. Zahn. I would ask other board members to do the same over the next couple of weeks, and he can then compile them and forward to Mr. Goodell. He can then respond in writing, and we'll have that available as a public record for anyone who's interested as we continue this discussion. I would note before we move on, I don't think we have the charter ability to do an FPL net as was, or fiber net, whatever their model was.
Yeah, to be clear, I was thinking about the dark fiber side of it, and not the lit side. So.
Still don't have the ability to commercialize it under our charter, I think. So, Mr. Cumber, search committee report. Oh, thank you. You're welcome to stick around for it.
Thank you for everybody's time.
Thanks, Jason.
Of course.
Did you have other members of your team here?
You. Mark Widener. And Steve Winterburn, who is the brains behind the presentation.
Thank you both for your contributions. Thank you, Jason. Mr. Cumber?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I know this is of utmost importance to the board, but I will be quick, knowing that we are running behind. On July 16th, the CEO Search Committee met. Chair Howard and Board Member Green were in attendance. I do want to thank our Hydrick and Struggles staff, Kay and Sean, who have done a great job. I don't think they're here today, but they've done a great job in staffing this committee to make sure we were prepared for today's meeting. I do want to note for the board that going forward, Councilmember Schellenberg had left, but we are going to invite him to all the meetings so he can participate. I know there's great interest from City Council, and therefore he'll be able to report back as needed. We did come up with a timeline for the search, and I'm going to walk you through that at a high level. Assuming today there was board action on the position description that we'll get to, Hydrick and Struggles is prepared to publicly post the position for the next 45 days. They will then work in coming up with a qualified list of candidates for us. The search committee will meet in the beginning of October to take that list, and the search committee will meet one-on-one with each one of those candidates at the beginning of October. We will then meet in mid-October, mid to end of October, to come up with our recommendation of the top X number of candidates. We haven't put a number on it, because until you see the field and where people shake out, we don't want to arbitrarily say it's 3, 4, 5, et cetera. Our goal then is to, in the beginning of November, before Thanksgiving, give every member of the board the opportunity to meet one-on-one with each one of those candidates. We will come to the board meeting that has now been moved to November 27th. We will have a public interview with each one of those candidates. And then, depending on how we feel on November 27th, we can either move to a vote that day, or we've floated the idea that we could have a special meeting in December if we needed that. The goal is to have on board on January 1st a permanent CEO. And I think that's just important from the standpoint of when Hydra goes out, they're able to communicate a timeline to candidates so they know whether or not they want to put their resume in or not. As part of that, we did talk about a little bit of background checks that Hydrick will do. The committee was pretty strong in wanting to ensure that a thorough background was done. That doesn't just include the normal criminal background and stuff like that, but that candidates' previous employers, previous board members, previous colleagues, would all be contacted. I personally made kind of the offhand comment that usually when you ask people for a list of people to call, they give you, their mother, their sister, and their best friend, right? So we need to kind of go beyond that list and really do something comprehensive. The chair brought up a great point of just given the Me Too environment that we're in, we need to make sure that those types of issues are fully vetted. The position specification was included in your board packet. We do need action today if we wanted to move forward with Hydric posting that. There were about 10 different items that were changed in there. I would say most of them were more clarification purposes, but I do want to bring up one point, which is we added that C-suite experience was a requirement or should be a requirement. We did not get into how many years of experience the person needed to have. I think the feeling is given the comprehensive nature of the position specification, the feeling from the committee was somebody had to have a significant number of years in the industry in order to meet that position specification. So, do you pick a year of 10, 12, 15, et cetera? It wasn't as important as the fact that it was a candidate that strongly matched that position specification. So, Mr. Chair, I will stop there to see if there's any questions or comments from my fellow committee members. If not, I would ask for a motion from the board on the position specification.
I didn't have anything to add from the search committee perspective. Ms. Green?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. The recommendation from the search committee is that we adopt the position statement that was included in your board packages for publication by the search firm of Hydric and Struggles. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Or was that Ms. Johnson?
Ms. Johnson.
Ms. Johnson. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Mr. Cumber. Any discussion on the position statement?
Remind me again, if you would, who's on the selection committee?
Well, funny you should ask. We've got one appointment forthcoming under the chair's report, but it's chaired by Mr. Cumber, and Ms. Green and myself are the other two members. Any comments? You both are captains of industry and have seen a lot of these. Mr. Campion?
I think this is certainly captures the job. I think, like all things, it's the personality and the experience and that person's vision and what they bring to the table and how they convince this board that they will be the best person for the job, for the shareholders, which are customers, and protect a very, very valuable asset of the citizenry of Jacksonville. So I think it's going to be very interactive.
I would just emphasize the search committee, as Mr. Cumber summarized, was quite insistent that the entire board would interview that short list when it's narrowed down. Ms. Johnson?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was here at the workshop and kind of saw the preliminary part of it, and so where this has really culminated is some good modifications to really start to kind of put a structure around the right person for the role, but it is going to be interactive. It's going to be something that the individual will have to captivate a lot of tangible and intangible skill sets. So I'm interested in the process, but I think this is a good start.
Ms. Green?
No comment.
Ms. Flanagan?
No comments.
I don't have anything to add, except I did receive an email comment. Many thanks to the public who feel free to send me emails all the time. Thank you for that. I even look at them. One of the comments that came in from one of our dutiful members of the public was that our charter actually specifies some requirements as to the CEO Managing Director position. And so not referenced in here is a charter requirement that the successful candidate have graduated from an accredited college or university or have 10 years of managerial experience. I think we covered the latter one, but a graduate of a college or university should be a minimum. Don't think that'll be an issue, but I make that observation. Any other comments or questions, suggestions about the position statement? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Unanimously approved. Mr. Cumber, anything else?
Nothing else, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for that report, and thank you for the time that you've devoted to this. It is not a light undertaking. We're now up to old business. Does anyone have any old business to come before the board?
Do
Yes,
have
sir.
one question. At Finance and Audit, I don't remember when that last meeting was, we did talk about how JEA management was prepared to come before the board on the demand rate issue. So I didn't know if that had gotten scheduled yet for a certain month looking forward.
We are going to be talking about the demand rate under the DER conversation of the board meeting in August as a rate, basically a policy element associated with distributed energy resources. So we'll be covering distributed energy resources more broadly, and obviously bringing forward some of the statistics on different policy initiatives you can take. As to looking at the demand rate and implementing it full scale, no, we have not scheduled that. But I think it's more important to look at DER comprehensively as opposed to just looking at a single policy and then trying to enact it and then try and design a business around it.
My ask would be is I'm fine with that. I'd want to get through August and really kind of have a discussion from a board perspective if we want to move forward with demand rate. You know, it's been something we've talked about for 3 years now, and so.
Do you want to do that before or after?
No, we could let's get through August.
In the
you know,
strategic
let's
planning process?
Yeah, and then we should think about, have board discussion during the August presentation as to whether or not we want management to come back with some options for us to take action on.
So, okay.
Either pull that out or build it in as part of the strategic plan.
Exactly.
Yeah. Any other old business? Other new business? For those of you new to the board, I'm sure you got your lecture on sunshine. We're not allowed to talk to one another during the periods in between meetings, only in a publicly noticed forum. So this is an open discussion time on our agenda where anyone can bring up anything to talk amongst ourselves, old business, new business, or otherwise. So any discussion items? So you didn't know that. Next time you'll be prepared, you'll come with something.
Thank you.
Anyone? No? Mr. Zahn?
I just want to recognize Daryl Cahoon, who is our new Vice President and General Manager of Water and Wastewater. He's been with the firm for about 25 years, and we are extremely excited to have him as part of the senior leadership. And he's hit the ground running, and just kudos to him and congratulations.
Welcome. Chair's report. I have one appointment to make to the search committee. It was toss-up really between Ms. Johnson, Mr. Campion. Mr. Campion, you lost. So welcome to the search committee.
Oh.
Is there anything else to come before the board?
Yes,
All right, we stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.